The Jerome War Relocation Center was a Japanese-American internment camp located in southeastern Arkansas near the town of Jerome. Opened from October 6, 1942, until June 30, 1944, it was the last relocation camp to open and the first to close, and at one point it held as many as 8,497 inhabitants. After closing, it was converted into a holding camp for German prisoners of war. Today, there are few remains of the camp still visible, the most prominent being the smokestack from the hospital incinerator. Jerome is located 30 miles southwest of the Jerome War Relocation Center, due to the large number of Japanese Americans detained there. These two camps were briefly the fifth and sixth largest towns in Arkansas. Both camps were served by the same rail line. A 10-foot-high granite monument marks the camp location and history. The marker is located on U.S. Highway 165 at County Road 210, approximately 8 miles south of Ermit, Arkansas. On December 21, 2006, President George W. Bush signed H.R. 1492 into law, guaranteeing $38 million in federal money to restore the Jerome Relocation Center along with 9 other former Japanese internment camps. The 2004 PBS documentary film Time of Fear outlines this history of the camp and the similar camp in nearby Rowe, Arkansas. History of the camp. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 brought the United States into World War II, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized military leaders to declare the West Coast a military zone from which persons who posed a threat to security could be excluded. This allowed for the evacuation of 120,000 Japanese Americans, who were rounded up and placed into concentration camps isolated in the country's interior. The Jerome War Relocation Camp was located in southeast Arkansas in Chico and Drew counties. It was one of 2 relocation centers in Arkansas, the other being at Rowe, 27 miles north of Jerome. The Jerome site was situated on 10,054 acres of tax-delinquent land in the marshy delta of the Mississippi River's floodplain that had been purchased in the 1930s by the Farm Security Administration, despite initial resistance from then-Governor Homer Adkins, who only agreed to allow the camp after exacting a guarantee that the Japanese American inmates would be watched by armed white guards and removed from the state at the end of the war. The War Relocation Authority acquired the land in 1942. The A.J. Rife Construction Company of Dallas, Texas, working under the supervision of the Army Corps of Engineers, built the Jerome camp at a cost of $4,703,347. The architect of the camp, Edward F. Neild of Shreveport, Louisiana, also designed the camp at Rowe in Desha County. Jerome was divided into 50 blocks surrounded by a barbed wire fence, a patrol road, and 7 watchtowers. Administrative and community spaces such as schools, offices and the hospital were separate from the 36 residential blocks, which each consisted of 12 barracks divided into several apartments, in addition to communal dining and sanitary facilities. Approximately 250 to 300 individuals lived in each block. The only entrances were from the main highway on the west and at the back of the camp to the east. The camp was not finished when its first inmates began to arrive from California assembly centers, and these earlier arrivals worked to complete construction. It was the last center to open and the first to close, and was only in operation for 634 days, the fewest number of days of any of the relocation camps. The constant movement of camp populations makes completely accurate statistics difficult. As of January 1943, the camp had a population of 7,932 people, and the following month Jerome reached its peak at nearly 8,500. Most had lived in Los Angeles or farmed in and around Fresno and Sacramento before the war, but some 10% of Jerome's population came from Hawaii. 14% were over the age of 60, and there were 2,483 school-aged children in the camp. 31% of the total population. 39% of the residents were under the age of 19. 66% were American citizens, having been born in the United States. The Ise, or first-generation parents and grandparents of these children, who were prohibited from obtaining citizenship along with other East Asians, were officially referred to as aliens. The camp was closed at the end of June 1944 and turned into a German prisoner of war camp called Camp Hermit. Many inmates had already been transferred to the Tule Lake camp in California, and, upon closing, most of the remaining camp residents were sent to Roa and Gila River. Camp life and social clubs. Camp residents spent the day working at farming, the sawmill, or making soap. The barracks were small and provided little insulation. Sometimes several families would share a one-room apartment that did not provide enough room for even one family. Project Director Paul A. Taylor warned residents that leaving the camp without permission and trespassing on private property were punishable offenses. Having thousands of people live in such close proximity to each other caused sickness and disease on several occasions. In January 1944, a case of influenza spread throughout the camp for several months. The hospital at Jerome was acknowledged as the best equipped and best staffed of any WRA center, and provided enough medical assistance to alleviate most health problems. Social and culture clubs were formed by residents of the relocation center. The Jovial Peppers was a group of girls, ages 9 to 12. The Phi Beta Society consisted of a group of young women whose main purpose was improving the cultural background. Other clubs included Cub Scouts and the Double X's. Recreation and sports were very popular. Sports consisted of basketball, weightlifting, boxing, wrestling, and volleyball. Basketball drew the most attention from sports lovers. In one match noted as an annihilation, the Shamrocks defeated the Commandos 19-2. Frank Horiuchi got credit for the lone basket on the losing side. Art classes and piano lessons were offered. Adult education classes included English, sewing, drafting, flower arrangement, commercial law, photography and art. Dances and movies were frequently available. Resistance to military enlistment and the loyalty questionnaire. As at the other WRA camps, many of the Nisei residents were asked to volunteer for the armed forces, and all adults were required to submit to an assessment of the loyalty to the United States. Pressure to join the all-Nisei 442nd Regimental Combat Team was somewhat higher at Jerome and Roa, which were much closer to the unit's training facilities at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, and became popular destinations for 442nd soldiers on leave. Colonel Scobie, executive to the Assistant Secretary of War, visited Jerome on March 4, 1943 to persuade eligible internees to enlist in the 442nd. He gave a speech stating that the War Department was in effect presenting the 442nd as a test of loyalty, and if response was poor, the public would believe the Nisei were not loyal Americans. The so-called loyalty questionnaire met with resistance in Jerome largely because of its last two questions, which asked if men would be willing to serve in the military and if all respondents would disavow their allegiance allegiance to Japan. Many were confused by the question's wording, unsure if an affirmative answer to the second would be taken as an admission of previous disloyalty. Others, especially among the citizen Nisei, were offended by the implication that they were somehow un-American yet ought to risk their lives for a country that had imprisoned them, due to an earlier dispute with administration over working conditions in Jerome and the death of an inmate in an on-the-job accident. Tensions in camp were already high, and in separate incidents on March 6, 1943, 2 men seen as administration collaborators were beaten. Jerome inmates subsequently gave negative qualified responses to the question regarding Japanese allegiance at a higher rate than at any other WRA camp. Mitsuho Kimura was one of 6 members of a committee of inmates who conferred with Director Paul Taylor that they would protest the WRA's evacuee registration program. Kimura, who was born in Hawaii in 1919 and attended high school in Japan from 1932 to 1935 before returning to the U.S. territory, was characterized by a naval intelligence informant as a very dangerous type of individual. Quote, "He stated that he was loyal to Japan before Pearl Harbor, and that his loyalty to Japan had increased after Pearl Harbor. He asserted that he would not fight in the U.S. Army under any conditions but would readily fight in the Japanese Army against the United States, and organized group meetings at Jerome with other pro-Japanese inmates." The committee refused to register because they were loyal to Japan. 781 evacuees in the group registered by writing across the face of the registration form that they wanted to be repatriated or expatriated to Japan. Only 31 people, or 2% of an eligible 1,579, volunteered for the 442nd, and 30% of Jerome residents were ultimately classified as disloyal. The lack of volunteers for the 442nd was partly blamed on timing, as it was presented at the same time as the call for camp residents to fill out the unpopular loyalty questionnaire, and Paul A. Taylor highly praised the 31 volunteers, saying they deserved respect and had demonstrated their loyalty. An article by Galen M. Fisher was written in the Denson Tribune in an attempt to persuade more to volunteer, titled "What a Person Outside Is Thinking." Quote, "It said that refusal to cooperate would poison the public mind and prove the disloyalty of the detainees. On the other hand, he stated that cooperation would hamstring the Fair Play Committee and be in tune with the philosophy of the ideal America." The 2,247 who had given unfavorable responses to the loyalty questionnaire were transferred to Tule Lake, which had recently been converted into a segregated camp for disloyal Japanese Americans. Leave clearance at Jerome. Camp residents were allowed to leave the camp with permission to pursue jobs. However, many did not want to leave without the guarantees of food and a place to stay. Another drawback was that the process of getting a leave clearance was slow, causing some to lose interest. The draft and registration processes also complicated getting a leave clearance. Camp closing. The Jerome Relocation Camp closed in June 1944 and was converted into a holding camp for German prisoners of war. Today there are few remains of the camp standing, the most prominent being the smokestack from the hospital incinerator. A 10-foot-high granite monument marks the camp location and gives details of its history. The Jerome Relocation Center was in operation for a total of 634 days, which was the fewest of any of the relocation camps. Although the registration process caused riots and trouble in the camp, the Denson Tribune reported on June 11, 1944 that the camp was free from juvenile delinquency. Young girls and boys are well-behaved, well-disciplined, well-trained, well-taught, and well-led. Rowdyism, pranks, swearing, petty theft and juvenile vices are practically nil. There were no reports of vandalism. This contrasts with poorer results in some of the other camps. Once the camp was closed, the remaining residents were transferred. Heart Mountain received 507 residents. Gila River received 2,055. Grenada received 514 and Roja received 2,522. Notable Jerome internees: Violet Kazuda Cristoforo, a Japanese-American poet, also interned at Tule Lake. Takayo Fisher, an American stage, film and TV actress, also interned at Rowa. George Hoshida, a Japanese-American artist who made drawings of his experience during his incarceration in 3 internment camps, also interned at Gila River. Lawson Fuseo Inada, an American poet, also interned at Grenada. Yuri Kochiyama, a Japanese-American human rights activist. Roy Matsumoto, a United States Army soldier and inductee of the U.S. Army Rangers Hall of Fame and the Military Intelligence Corps Hall of Fame. George Nakano, a former California State Assemblyman. Joe M. Nishimoto, a United States Army soldier and a recipient of the Medal of Honor. Henry Sugimoto, Japanese-born artist, also interned at Rowa. Mary Tsukamoto, a teacher, community activist, and civil rights activist. V. Vale, publisher, author, musician. Conrad Jammer, a theater, film, and television actor. Aiko Herzog Yoshinaga, political activist, also interned at Manzana and Rowa.